The middle way. There is a very important passage in Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle way, Madhyamaka, where he states, "That which is dependently originated I call empty, and that is in turn dependently designated." The idea is that whatever is dependently originated is empty in the ultimate sense, and that what we designate dependently is nothing other than empty phenomena. The fact that things and events are dependently designated implies that they are not non-existent, they are not mere nothingness. So when an understanding of dependent origination is combined with an understanding of emptiness, we find that this enables an individual to tread the middle way, so-called, because it avoids the extremes of absolutism and nihilism. So the Madhyamaka expression, dependently designated, has a deep significance. The first word, dependently, implies that things and events come into being through dependence on other factors, which means that they do not possess independent, autonomous, or absolute existence. So this first point negates absolutism. The second word, designated, implies that things and events are not mere nothingness, that they are not non-existent, that they do indeed exist. This part of the expression therefore ensures that the reality of the phenomenal world is not denied. As Buddhapalita states in his commentary on the fundamentals of the middle way, if things and events have an independent existential status and come into being without depending on other factors, then why are their designations dependent and interrelated? In connection with this point, I have been told by various physicists that they are beginning to have problems in postulating an idea of reality that is in accordance with the quantum understanding of the physical world. Even as a concept, reality is a problem. For me, this points to the difficulty of finding essences when we look into the essence of things. However, if we jump to the other extreme and say that everything is pure illusion and a mere projection of the mind, then we will be falling into the trap into which the Chittamatrins fell, namely the view of total mentalism. So if things do not possess intrinsic reality, and yet at the same time, if we are not happy with the conclusion that everything is a mere projection of the mind, what is the alternative? What is the middle way? The answer given by the Madhyamikas is that things and events arise purely as a result of the aggregation of many factors, and their conventional existence stems from the identity we impute to each aggregation. As regards the exposition of the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness, generally we find there are many forms of reasoning presented in the literature which are designed to lead to an understanding of emptiness. Of all of these, the reasoning that is based on the understanding of dependent origination is considered to be the most effective. In order to develop the most profound understanding of the meaning of dependent origination, I think the works of Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti are crucial. Much of my own understanding, and naturally most of the presentation I am making here, is based on Lama Tsongkhapa's exposition of these topics, which in turn is very much based on the reading of Nagarjuna by Chandrakirti and Buddhapalita, to the extent that Tsongkhapa substantiates almost every crucial point by referring to the commentaries of these two great masters. When I study Nagarjuna's Fundamentals of the Middle Way, I combine the 23rd chapter dealing with the 12 links of dependent origination with the 18th chapter on Anatman. This latter chapter shows how it is the process of grasping at an eternal principle or a substantially real soul that binds us to unenlightened existence. It further shows how negating the principle of Atman and eliminating that grasping lead to liberation. The main point is to underline how important it is to gain insight into emptiness. I then combine my study of these two chapters with that of the 24th, in which Nagarjuna anticipates a number of the objections which could be put forward by the realist schools of Buddhism. The core of their objections could be summarized in this way: if there is no intrinsic reality, and if there is no intrinsic existence and identity to things and events, then there is no thing. It follows that there cannot be any Four Noble Truths. If there are no Four Noble Truths, there are no three jewels. If there are no three jewels, there cannot be a path to enlightenment. Nagarjuna responds by turning the realists' own criticism against them, by saying that, on the contrary, if things do exist intrinsically, then the consequences the realists attribute to his argument would apply to theirs. That is to say, if things are intrinsically real, then the Four Noble Truths would not apply, nor could causes produce effects. So the central message of that chapter is to demonstrate that what Nagarjuna means by emptiness is not a mere nothingness or a mere non-existence. Emptiness should be understood in terms of the interdependent nature of reality. It is by virtue of their dependent origination that things are devoid of independent existence. Lodrö Gyatso, a Tibetan master from Amdo, captured this point in a beautiful verse. Point 1. He said that emptiness in this context does not mean the absence of functionality. What does it mean then? It is the emptiness of real or absolute existence. Dependent origination does not entail intrinsic reality or intrinsic identity, but what it does entail is illusion-like phenomenal reality. So, when you understand the meaning of both emptiness and dependent origination, you can posit emptiness and appearance simultaneously within one locus without contradiction. Furthermore, the same master added that all philosophical schools describe their own position as avoiding the extreme of absolutism by talking about some form of emptiness, and avoiding the other extreme of nihilism by talking about the level of phenomenal reality. He pointed out, however, that it is only when you reverse the process that you overcome all forms of clinging. That is the Madhyamaka Prasangika position, of course. From the point of view of Madhyamaka Prasangika, then, it is through understanding appearance that a person is liberated from grasping onto absolutes, and it is by understanding the true meaning of emptiness that a person is freed from falling into nihilism. The Madhyamaka schools. Earlier I spoke about there being two different understandings of emptiness, even within the Madhyamaka school itself, and I outlined how the Madhyamaka Svatantrika view differs from that of the Madhyamaka Prasangika. The basis for accepting this difference comes from the writings of Bhavaviveka, one of the chief disciples of Nagarjuna, who subjects the Buddhist realist schools to very critical examination, and at the same time criticizes Buddhapalitas. Reading of Nagarjuna. Bhavaviveka's own position emerges through these two critiques. In essence, he maintains that although they deny absolute existence, they do accept some form of intrinsic and objective reality to things and events, which Madhyamaka Prasangika masters like Chandrakirti totally reject. So, although Chandrakirti, Buddhapalita, and Bhavaviveka were all great disciples of Nagarjuna, there is a substantial difference in their respective understanding of Nagarjuna's philosophy of emptiness. It is on account of this difference that Tibetan Buddhist scholars distinguish two divisions within the Madhyamaka school, which they call Svatantrika and Prasangika. These two schools also differ in their methodology. The Madhyamaka Prasangikas lay much greater emphasis on what is called the consequentialist style of reasoning. This resembles the reductio ad absurdum, where you are not so much using reason to affirm something yourself, but rather you are concerned with showing the internal inconsistencies of your opponent's standpoint. In contrast, the Madhyamaka Svatantrikas tend to use a syllogistic type of reasoning to establish their own positions. Furthermore, there is another fundamental difference between Bhavaviveka and Chandrakirti, which concerns the way our senses perceive material objects. For Bhavaviveka, it is valid to say that when a visual perception arises, we see the appearance of an objective entity, because he accepts that things do possess a degree of objectivity, which is then projected onto the perception. This is totally rejected by the Madhyamaka Prasangika school of Chandrakirti. It is clear, therefore, that the central point of difference between the two Madhyamaka schools is whether or not one accepts any idea of intrinsicality. Applying our understanding of emptiness. The reason why it is so important to understand this subtle point is because of its implications for interpreting our own personal experience of life. When strong emotions arise in you, say, attachment or anger, if you examine the experience of that emotion, you will see that underlying it is an assumption that there is something objective and real out there which you are holding onto which you project desirable or undesirable qualities. According to the kind of qualities you project onto a thing or event, you feel either attracted to it or repulsed by it. So strong emotional responses in fact assume the existence of some form of objective reality. However, if you realize that there is no intrinsic reality to things and events, then of course this will automatically help you to understand that no matter how real and strong emotions may seem, they have no valid basis. Once you know that they are actually based on a fundamental misconception of reality, then the emotions themselves become untenable. On the other hand, if your understanding of emptiness is not thorough, in the sense that you have not succeeded in negating the notion of intrinsicality completely, then of course your attitude towards emotion will be somewhat ambivalent. You may feel that there is some sense in which it is valid or justified. When you have developed a certain understanding of emptiness, albeit an intellectual one, you will have a new outlook on things and events which you can compare to your usual responses. You will notice how much we tend to project qualities onto the world. More especially, you will realize that most of our strong emotions arise from assuming the reality of something that is unreal. In this way, you may be able to gain an experiential sense of the disparity between the way you perceive things and the way things really are. The moral that we can draw from all of this is that the strong emotions which afflict our mind arise from a fundamental state of confusion, which leads us to apprehend things as real and existing independently. In conclusion, we know that afflictive emotions and thoughts have no valid basis, neither in our experience nor in reality, nor in reason. By contrast, your insight into the emptiness of things is not only grounded in reason but also in experience. It has valid support. In addition, your understanding of emptiness and your grasping at things as real are directly opposed to one another, so one cancels the other out. Since they are opposing forces, and given that one has valid grounding, whereas the other does not, the final conclusion we can draw is that the more we deepen our understanding of emptiness, and the greater the power of our insight becomes, the more we see through the deception of emotions, and consequently, the weaker those emotions become. Indeed, we come to realize that strong afflictive emotions and thoughts, and their basis, which is ignorance, can be weakened, while insight into emptiness can be enhanced. Liberation. We have arrived at a point in our examination where we can conceivably accept that the power of delusions and of ignorance can be reduced, but the question remains as to whether it is at all possible to eliminate them completely and eradicate them from our minds. Some of the points in Maitreya's Uttara Tantra may be very critical here. According to that text, our potential for knowledge is intrinsic to our consciousness and is an inherent natural quality of our mind, whereas all those factors which afflict the mind are not an essential part of it. Mental afflictions are distinct from the essential nature of our mind and are therefore called adventitious. So when we talk about gaining the perfect wisdom of a Buddha, we should not think that we need to create qualities in ourselves that are not there already and acquire them from somewhere outside of us. Rather, we should see perfect Buddha wisdom as a potential that is being realized. The defilements of the mind hamper the natural expression of that potential which is inherent in our consciousness. It is as if the capacity for unobstructed knowledge is there in our mind, but the defilements obscure and hinder it from being fully developed and expressed. However, once our understanding of the mind is informed by the idea that the essential nature of mind is pure luminosity and mere experience, or the sheer capacity to know, we can then conceive of the possibility of eliminating these afflictions completely. To sum up in this chapter, we have followed the conceptual approach to the question of whether or not it is actually possible to attain liberation. Finally, if we accept that liberation is possible, how exactly is it to be understood? In the scriptures, liberation is characterized in terms of 4 features. The first feature describes it as the true cessation of the continuum of afflictions. According to the second feature, liberation is true peace, the state of total tranquility, where the individual has attained complete freedom from all defilements of the mind. It is described in the third feature as totally satisfying, because one has reached ultimate satisfaction. Fourthly, it is described as definite emergence, in the sense that one has definitely emerged from the process of unenlightened existence, the truth of the path. If we accept that liberation is an achievable goal, how is it possible to achieve it? This question brings us to the fourth, noble truth, which deals with the true path. According to the Madhyamaka explanation, the true path should be understood in terms of developing a direct intuitive realization of emptiness. This is because the intuitive realization of emptiness leads directly to the attainment of cessation. However, in order to have such a realization, one must have a basis in single-pointed meditation, since this is what leads to an experiential knowledge of emptiness. The point at which an individual attains that experiential knowledge, one is said to be the beginning of what is called the path of connection or path of preparation, and the point at which he gains direct intuitive realization of emptiness is called the path of seeing. The experiential knowledge of emptiness must in turn be based on an intellectual understanding of emptiness, developed through inference. Indeed, without that, it is impossible to attain a meditatively based experience of emptiness. That initial stage of developing intellectual understanding is part of what is known as the path of accumulation. The threshold of this path is the point where the practitioner develops a genuine aspiration to attain liberation, and this we consider to be the very beginning of the Buddhist path. The Shravakayana path, even before we embark upon the path, a great deal of preparation is necessary. To begin with, the most important practice is that of the three higher trainings, the trainings in morality, scat, shila concentration or meditation, scat, samadhi, and wisdom or insight, scat, prajna. The scriptures generally describe the transition from one stage to another in terms of a meditator's experience. It is important to understand, therefore, that the actual path on which the individual travels is that of his or her progressively deepening knowledge and realization of emptiness, technically known as the wisdom aspect of the path. Moreover, the wisdom that realizes emptiness must be developed within the context of the union of the single-pointedness of mind and penetrative insight known as the union of shamatha and vipassana. In order to experience a union of these two, we have to develop shamatha first, for only this will enable us to channel our energy and concentration. Training in shamatha is therefore key. For it to be successful, two factors must be present, namely the application of mindfulness and the application of mental alertness. These two capacities themselves will only develop successfully if our single-pointedness of mind is based on an ethically sound life in which we apply discipline both to our attitude and to our way of life. This, of course, underlines the fundamental importance of morality. So now we can see how the three trainings are connected to each other. All of these practices are common to both the Shravakayana and the Mahayana. The Mahayana path. We must now look at another important aspect of Buddhism, namely the way that the entire teaching of Buddha is founded on compassion. Compassion is the very foundation of the Dharma. The practice of enhancing our good heart and developing an altruistic mind is aimed at deepening our understanding of compassion and invigorating the compassionate potential that exists within us. It is on the basis of profound compassion that we develop the altruistic aspiration to seek enlightenment for the benefit of all. Traditionally, this is called the generation of bodhicitta. What is bodhicitta? In Maitreya's Abhisamaya-lamkara, bodhicitta is described as having two motivating factors. The first is genuine compassion towards all beings, and the second is recognition of the need to attain full enlightenment in order to fulfill the welfare of others. Indeed, to develop the altruistic mind of bodhicitta, it is not enough to have mere compassion. Bodhicitta must be based on a compassion which carries a sense of responsibility so that you are willing to take upon yourself the task of helping others. This sense of responsibility will only arise if you have generated a spontaneous, genuine compassion which extends to all sentient beings without exception. This is universal compassion. It is called Mahakaruna, or great compassion, to distinguish it from ordinary compassion, which is limited. However, this itself will not arise unless you have genuine insight into the nature of suffering, both your own suffering and that of others. You recognize your state as being one of suffering, then you will also feel a genuine empathy and connection with others. So far as gaining insight into the nature of suffering is concerned, reflection on the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, will assist you in deepening your insight. For an altruistic practitioner, it is important to realize that attaining liberation for oneself alone is not enough. Not only is it individualistic, but even from the point of view of one's own path to perfection, it is not a state of full awakening. It is therefore crucial to nurture our natural empathy and our sense of closeness with others. One of the methods described in the Buddhist scriptures for doing this is to imagine that all beings are your mothers or someone else who is dear to you. You awaken the compassion you naturally feel for your mother or someone dear and extend it to all other beings. In this way, you develop a natural and spontaneous empathy. However, empathy cannot arise if your emotions towards others fluctuate due to the fact that you view some as enemies and others as friends. That discrimination has to be overcome first, and for this the practice of equanimity is fundamental. A different method is presented by Shantideva in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Bodhicharyavatara. He explains a way of cultivating genuine empathy by considering others as equal to oneself. For example, just as you personally wish to be happy and overcome suffering, others too have a similar desire, and just as you have the right to achieve this, so do they. With that sense of equality, you reverse your self-centered perspective, putting yourself in others' shoes and relating to them as if they were dearer to you than you are to yourself. According to the Tibetan tradition, these two different methods are combined and then meditated upon. Once you have gained even a simulated experience of the altruistic mind as a result of your reflection and meditation, then the custom is to stabilize and reinforce it by participating in a ceremony where you explicitly generate bodhicitta. This should then be followed by a keen desire to engage in the activities of a bodhisattva. According to tradition, the practitioner formally takes the vows of a bodhisattva at that point. The bodhisattva ideal, or the activities of a bodhisattva, are summed up in the 3 precepts. The first is the precept of refraining from negative actions. The second is the precept of deliberately engaging in virtuous actions. And the third is the precept of helping others. From the point of view of how causal practices lead to a resultant state, bodhisattva practices are also sometimes described in terms of the 2 accumulations, the accumulations of merit and wisdom. The 2 accumulations come together in the union of method and wisdom, and in the Buddhist path should never be separated. The Vajrayana path. The profundity and sophistication of tantra or Vajrayana stem from the practice of unifying method and wisdom. To put it very briefly, one of the unique features of the union of method and wisdom in the Vajrayana teachings is that the practitioner first subjects his or her perception of self and the world to an understanding of emptiness and dissolves everything into emptiness. That cognition of emptiness is then visualized imaginatively, of course at the beginning, as the perfect form of a meditational deity. Next, you reflect on the non-substantial or empty nature of that deity. So within one instance of cognition, both method and wisdom are present and complete. There is visualization of a deity and at the same time an understanding of the empty nature of that deity. Within the Vajrayana tradition, there are 4 principal classes of Tantra according to the Gelug Sakya and Kagyu schools. These are Kriya Tantra, Karya Tantra, Yoga Tantra, and highest Yoga Tantra, Anuttara Yoga Tantra. The first 2 classes do not involve taking Vajrayana vows. It is in the Yoga Tantra and highest Yoga Tantra that tantric vows are taken. The highest Yoga Tantra also has meditative practices which use various physiological elements such as visualizing the energy channels of the body, the energies that flow within the channels, the subtle drops, and so on. In all of these various types of meditation, the key is always the aspiration of bodhicitta and insight into emptiness. Without these 2 factors, none of them would even be considered to be Buddhist practices. However, in some very reliable and authentic texts belonging to Yoga Tantra, it is said that the Vajrayana path can also be based on the understanding of emptiness held by the Chittamatra school, not necessarily on that of the Madhyamaka. Despite this, I feel that if tantric practice is to be comprehensive, and if one is to attain full realization of the tantric path, an insight into emptiness based on the Madhyamaka is actually crucial. Advice on following the Buddhist path. There are 3 pieces of advice I would like to share with you. The first is to say that unless you are able to establish a firm grounding in the basic practices of the Buddha Dharma, such as those I have outlined, then even the supposedly profound practices of the Vajrayana will have no effect. The point is that for a practicing Buddhist, it is really vital to develop an understanding of the Four Noble Truths and to meditate upon them. Meditation should therefore be an essential part of your practice and include both shamatha and vipassana. Another important factor is your determination. You should not imagine that all these developments can take place within a few days or a few years. They may even take several eons, so determination is evidently vital. If you consider yourself a Buddhist and want to really practice Buddha Dharma, then right from the start you must make up your mind to do so until the end, regardless of whether it takes millions or billions of eons. After all, what is the meaning of our life? In itself, there is no intrinsic meaning. However, if we use life in a positive way, then even the days and the months and the aeons can become meaningful. On the other hand, if you just fritter your life away aimlessly, then even one day feels too long. You will find that once you have a firm determination and a clear objective, then time is not important. As Shantideva writes in this beautiful prayer, "For as long as space exists and sentient beings endure, may I too remain to dispel the misery of the world." Point 1. His words really convey a certain understanding to me, and they are so inspiring. My final point is that the more impatient you are, and the more you want the way that is quickest, cheapest, or best, the more likely you are to obtain a poor result. So I suggest this is the wrong approach. Conclusion. If I were to essentialize my talk, I would say that if your understanding of the Four Noble Truths arises from deep reflections such as these, then you will gain a profound admiration for the Dharma, which is the true refuge, and you will also develop a conviction in the possibility of actualizing the Dharma within yourself. On the basis of such a conviction, you will be able to develop genuine devotion in the Buddha, the Master who showed you the path, and you will also have a deep respect for the Sangha members who are your spiritual companions on the path. If your understanding of the Three Jewels is based on a realization of the Four Noble Truths that is as profound as this, then whenever you think of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, they will come alive for you with renewed freshness. This is what is meant by going for refuge. In fact, to summarize even more succinctly, the whole of the explanation I have given here is to show what is meant by going for refuge in the Three Jewels. Although my own practice is very poor indeed, and although I recite mantras and visualize certain mandalas, even so the main emphasis of my daily practice is the Four Noble Truths and bodhicitta. These two practices, I feel, are of real practical benefit. Sometimes I think that visualizing deities can almost be like a way of deceiving oneself. In my view, we must pursue practice step by step with patience and determination. If you practice in this way, then after a year or after a decade, you will notice at least some improvement in yourself, and when you see that, it brings a new encouragement to continue. However, we must realize that change is not at all easy. So now you have read these teachings on the Four Noble Truths. If you consider you are a Buddhist, then please put them into practice. They should not remain merely on an intellectual level. Practice and teaching must be part of our life. The same applies, of course, to practitioners and believers of other faiths such as Christians, Muslims, or Jews. Whatever your faith, if you accept that faith, then it must become part of your life. It is not sufficient to attend church on Sunday and join your hands together in prayer for a few moments if the rest of your behavior remains the same. Whether or not you are physically in a church or a cathedral, I think the teaching of your own religion must be in your heart. That's very important. Only then will you have an experience of it that is of real value. Otherwise, it is simply a piece of knowledge in your head, and when you are faced with problems in life, it won't be of any help. Once the teaching is part of your life, whenever you have a real problem, it gives you inner strength. Also, when you grow old or have an incurable illness, and when death finally comes, then your practice truly gives you some kind of inner guarantee. After all, death is part of life. There is nothing strange about it. Sooner or later, we all have to pass through that gate. At that time, whether or not there is a life after it, is very valuable to have peace of mind. How can we achieve peace of mind at such a moment? It is possible only if we have some experience in ourselves that will provide inner strength, because no one else can provide this for us. No deities, no gurus, and no friends. This is why the Buddha says you must be your own master. Compassion, the basis for human happiness. I think that every human being has an innate sense of I. We cannot explain why that feeling is there, but it is. Along with it comes a desire for happiness and a wish to overcome suffering. This is quite justified. We have a natural right to achieve as much happiness as possible, and we also have the right to overcome suffering. The whole of human history has developed on the basis of this feeling. In fact, it is not limited to human beings. From the Buddhist point of view, even the tiniest insect has this feeling, and according to its capacity, is trying to gain some happiness and avoid unhappy situations. However, there are some major differences between human beings and other animal species. They stem from human intelligence. On account of our intelligence, we are much more advanced and have a greater capacity. We are able to think much further into the future, and our memory is powerful enough to take us back many years. Furthermore, we have oral and written traditions, which remind us of events many centuries ago. Now, thanks to scientific methods, we can even examine events which occurred millions of years ago. So our intelligence makes us very smart, but at the same time, precisely because of that fact, we also have more doubts and suspicions and hence more fears. I think the imagination of fear is much more developed in humans than in other animals. In addition, the many conflicts within the human family and within one's own family, not to mention the conflicts within the community and between nations, as well as the internal conflicts within the individual. All conflicts and contradictions arise from the different ideas and views our intelligence brings. So unfortunately, intelligence can sometimes create a quite unhappy state of mind. In this sense, it becomes another source of human misery. Yet at the same time, I think that ultimately intelligence is the tool with which we can overcome all these conflicts and differences. From this point of view, of all the various species of animal on the planet, human beings are the biggest troublemakers. That is clear. I imagine that if there were no longer any humans on the planet itself would be safer. Certainly millions of fish, chicken, and other small animals might enjoy some sort of genuine liberation. It is therefore important that human intelligence be utilized in a constructive way. That is the key. If we utilize its capacity properly, then not only human beings would become less harmful to each other and to the planet, but also individual human beings would be happier in themselves. It is in our hands. Whether we utilize our intelligence in the right way or the wrong way is up to us. Nobody can impose their values on us. How can we learn to use our capacity constructively? First, we need to recognize our nature, and then, if we have the determination, there is a real possibility of transforming the human heart. On this basis, I will speak today on how a human being can find happiness as an individual, because I believe the individual is the key to all the rest. For change to happen in any community, the initiative must come from the individual. If the individual can become a good, calm, peaceful person, this automatically brings a positive atmosphere to the family around him or her. When parents are warm-hearted, peaceful and calm people, generally speaking, their children will also develop that attitude and behavior. The way our attitude works is such that it is often troubled by outside factors. So one side of the issue is to eliminate the existence of trouble around you. The environment, meaning the surrounding situation, is a very important factor for establishing a happy frame of mind. However, even more important is the other side of the issue, which is one's own mental attitude. The surrounding situation may not be so friendly, it may even be hostile, but if your inner mental attitude is right, then the situation will not disturb your inner peace. On the other hand, if your attitude is not right, then even if you are surrounded by good friends and the best facilities, you cannot be happy. This is why mental attitude is more important than external conditions. Despite this, it seems to me that many people are more concerned about their external conditions and neglect the inner attitude of mind. I suggest that we should pay more attention to our inner qualities. There are a number of qualities which are important for mental peace, but from the little experience I have, I believe that one of the most important factors is human compassion and affection, a sense of caring. Let me explain what we mean by compassion. Usually, our concept of compassion or love refers to the feeling of closeness we have with our friends and loved ones. Sometimes, compassion also carries a sense of pity. This is wrong. Any love or compassion which entails looking down on the other is not genuine compassion. To be genuine compassion must be based on respect for the other and on the realization that others have the right to be happy and overcome suffering just as much as you. On this basis, since you can see that others are suffering, you develop a genuine sense of concern for them. As for the closeness we feel towards our friends, this is usually more like attachment than compassion. Genuine compassion should be unbiased. If we only feel close to our friends and not to our enemies, or to the countless people who are unknown to us personally and towards whom we are indifferent, then our compassion is only partial or biased. As I mentioned before, genuine compassion is based on the recognition that others have the right to happiness just like yourself, and therefore even your enemy is a human being with the same wish for happiness as you and the same right to happiness as you. A sense of concern developed on this basis is what we call compassion. It extends to everyone irrespective of whether the person's attitude towards you is hostile or friendly. One aspect of this kind of compassion is a sense of caring responsibility. When we develop that kind of motivation, our self-confidence increases automatically. This in turn reduces fear, and that serves as a basis for determination. If you are really determined right from the beginning to accomplish a difficult task, then even if you fail first time, second time, third time, it doesn't matter. Your aim is very clear, so you will continue to make an effort. This sort of optimistic and determined attitude is a key factor for success. Compassion also brings us an inner strength. Once it is developed, it naturally opens an inner door through which we can communicate with fellow human beings and even other sentient beings with ease and heart to heart. On the other hand, if you feel hatred and ill feeling towards others, they may feel similarly towards you. And as a result, suspicion and fear will create a distance between you and make communication difficult. You will then feel lonely and isolated. Not all members of your community will have similar negative feelings towards you, but some may look on you negatively because of your own feeling. If you harbor negative feelings towards others and yet expect them to be friendly to you, you are being illogical. If you want the atmosphere around you to be more friendly, you must first create the basis for that. Whether the response of others is positive or negative, you must first create the ground of friendliness. If others still respond to you negatively after this, then you have the right to act accordingly. I always try to create a ground of friendliness with people. Whenever I meet someone new, for example, I feel no need for introductions. The person is obviously another human being. Maybe sometime in the future technological advances may mean that I could confuse a robot for a human being, but up to now, this has never happened. I see a smile, some teeth and eyes and so on, and I recognize the person as a human being. On that basis, on the emotional level, we are the same, and basically on the physical level, we are the same, except for coloring. But whether Westerners have yellow hair or blue hair or white hair does not really matter. The important thing is that we are the same on the emotional level. With that conviction, I feel that the other person is a human brother and approach him spontaneously. In most cases, the other person immediately responds accordingly and becomes a friend. Sometimes I fail, and then I have the liberty to react according to the circumstances. Basically, therefore, we should approach others openly, recognizing each person as another human being just like ourselves. There is not so much difference between us all. Compassion naturally creates a positive atmosphere, and as a result you feel peaceful and content. Wherever there lives a compassionate person, there is always a pleasant atmosphere. Even dogs and birds approach the person easily. Almost 50 years ago, I used to keep some birds in the Nonviolence summer palace in Lhasa. Among them was a small parrot. At that time, I had an elderly attendant whose appearance was somewhat unfriendly. He had very round, stern eyes, but he was always feeding this parrot with nuts and so on. So whenever the attendant would appear, just the sound of his footsteps or his coughing would mean the parrot would show some excitement. The attendant had an extraordinarily friendly manner with that small bird, and the parrot also had an amazing response to him. On a few occasions I fed him some nuts, but he never showed such friendliness to me, so I started to poke him with a stick, hoping he might react differently. The result was totally negative. I was using more force than the bird had, so it reacted accordingly. Therefore, if you want a genuine friend first, you must create a positive atmosphere around you. We are social animals after all, and friends are very important. How can you bring a smile to people's faces? If you remain stony and suspicious, it is very difficult. Perhaps if you have power or money, some people may offer you an artificial smile, but a genuine smile will only come from compassion. The question is how to develop compassion. In fact, can we really develop unbiased compassion at all? My answer is that we definitely can. I believe that human nature is gentle and compassionate, although many people in the past and now think that it is basically aggressive. Let us examine this point. At the time of conception, and while we are in our mother's womb, our mother's compassionate and peaceful mental state is a very positive factor for our development. If the mother's mind is very agitated, it is harmful for us. And that is just the beginning of life. Even the parent's state of mind at conception is important. If a child is conceived through rape, for example, then it will be unwanted, which is a terrible thing. For conception to take place properly, it should come from genuine love and mutual respect, not just mad passion. It is not enough to have some casual love affair. The two partners should know each other well and respect each other as people. This is the basis for a happy marriage. Furthermore, marriage itself should be for life, or at least should be long-lasting. Life should properly start from such a situation. Then, according to medical science, in the few weeks after birth, the child's brain is still growing. During that period, the experts claim that physical touch is a crucial factor for the proper development of the brain. This alone shows that the mere growth of our body requires another's affection. After birth, one of the first acts on the mother's side is to give milk, and from the child's side it is to suckle. Milk is often considered a symbol of compassion. Without it, traditionally, the child cannot survive. Through the process of suckling, there comes a closeness between mother and child. If that closeness is not there, then the child will not seek its mother's breast. And if the mother is feeling dislike towards the child, her milk may not come freely. So milk comes with affection. This means that the first act of our life, that of taking milk, is a symbol of affection. I am always reminded of this when I visit a church and see Mary carrying Jesus as a small baby. That to me is a symbol of love and affection. It has been found that those children who grow up in homes where there is love and affection have a healthier physical development and study better at school. Conversely, those who lack human affection have more difficulty in developing physically and mentally. These children also find it difficult to show affection when they grow up, which is such a great tragedy. Now let us look at the last moment of our lives, death. Even at the time of death, although the dying person can no longer benefit much from his friends if he is surrounded by friends, his mind may be more calm. Therefore, throughout our lives from the very beginning, right up to our death, human affection plays a very important role. An affectionate disposition not only makes the mind more peaceful and calm, but it affects our body in a positive way too. On the other hand, hatred, jealousy, and fear upset our peace of mind, make us agitated, and affect our body adversely. Even our body needs peace of mind and is not suited to agitation. This shows that an appreciation of peace of mind is in our blood. Therefore, although some may disagree, I feel that although the aggressive side of our nature is part of life, the dominant force of life is human affection. This is why it is possible to strengthen that basic goodness which is our human nature. We can also approach the importance of compassion through intelligent reasoning. If I help another person and show concern for him or her, then I myself will benefit from that. However, if I harm others, eventually I will be in trouble. I often joke half sincerely and half seriously, saying that if we wish to be truly selfish, then we should be wisely selfish rather than foolishly selfish. Our intelligence can help to adjust our attitude in this respect. If we use it well, we can gain insight as to how we can fulfill our own self-interest by leading a compassionate way of life. It would even be possible to argue that being compassionate is ultimately selfish. In this context, I do not think that selfishness is wrong. Loving oneself is crucial. If we do not love ourselves, how can we love others? It seems that when some people talk of compassion, they have the notion that it entails a total disregard for one's own interests, a sacrificing of one's interests. This is not the case. In fact, genuine love should first be directed at oneself. There are two different senses of self. One has no hesitation in harming other people, and that is negative and leads to trouble. The other is based on determination, willpower, and self-confidence, and that sense of I is very necessary. Without it, how can we develop the confidence we need to carry out any task in life? Similarly, there are two types of desire also. However, hatred is invariably negative and destructive of harmony. How can we reduce hatred? Hatred is usually preceded by anger. Anger rises as a reactive emotion and gradually develops into a feeling of hatred. The skillful approach here is first to know that anger is negative. Often people think that as anger is part of us, it is better to express it, but I think this is misguided. You may have grievances or resentment due to your past, and by expressing your anger you might be able to finish with them. That is very possible. Usually, however, it is better to check your anger and then gradually, year by year, it diminishes. In my experience, this works best when you adopt the position that anger is negative and it is better not to feel it. That position itself will make a difference. Whenever anger is about to come, you can train yourself to see the object of your anger in a different light. Any person or circumstance which causes anger is basically relative. Seen from one angle, it makes you angry, but seen from another perspective, you may discover some good things in it. We lost our country, for example, and became refugees. If we look at our situation from that angle, we might feel frustration and sadness, yet the same event has created new opportunities. Meeting with other people from different religious traditions and so on. Developing a more flexible way of seeing things helps us cultivate a more balanced mental attitude. This is one method. There are other situations where you might fall sick, for example, and the more you think about your sickness, the worse your frustration becomes. In such a case, it is very helpful to compare your situation with the worst-case scenario related to your illness, or with what would have happened if you had caught an even more serious illness, and so on. In this way, you can console yourself by realizing that it could have been much worse. Here again, you train yourself to see the relativity of your situation. If you compare it with something that is much worse, this will immediately reduce your frustration. Similarly, if difficulties come, they may appear enormous when you look at them closely. But if you approach the same problem from a wider perspective, it appears smaller. With these methods, and by developing a larger outlook, you can reduce your frustration whenever you face problems. You can see that constant effort is needed, but if you apply it in this way, then the angry side of you will diminish. Meanwhile, you strengthen your compassionate side and increase your good potential. By combining these two approaches, a negative person can be transformed into a kind one. This is the method we use to effect that transformation. In addition, if you have religious faith, it can be useful in extending these qualities. For example, the Gospels teach us to turn the other cheek, which clearly shows the practice of tolerance. For me, the main message of the Gospels is love for our fellow human beings, and the reason we should develop this is because we love God. I understand this in the sense of having infinite love. Such religious teachings are very powerful to increase and extend our good qualities. The Buddhist approach presents a very clear method. First, we try to consider all sentient beings as equal. Then we consider that the lives of all beings are just as precious as our own, and through this we develop a sense of concern for others. What of the case of someone who has no religious faith? Whether we follow a religion or not is a matter of individual right. It is possible to manage without religion, and in some cases it may make life simpler. But when you no longer have any interest in religion, you should not neglect the value of good human qualities. As long as we are human beings and members of human society, we need human compassion. Without that, you cannot be happy. Since we all want to be happy, and to have a happy family and friends, we have to develop compassion and affection. It is important to recognize that there are two levels of spirituality. one with religious faith and one without. With the latter, we simply try to be a warm-hearted person. We should also remember that once we cultivate a compassionate attitude, non-violence comes automatically. Non-violence is not a diplomatic word, it is compassion in action. If you have hatred in your heart, then very often your actions will be violent, whereas if you have compassion in your heart, your actions will be non-violent. As I said earlier, as long as human beings remain on this earth, there will always be disagreements and conflicting views. We can take that as given. If we use violence in order to reduce disagreements and conflict, then we must expect violence every day. And I think the result of this is terrible. Furthermore, it is actually impossible to eliminate disagreements through violence. Violence only brings even more resentment and dissatisfaction. Non-violence, on the other hand, means dialogue. It means using language to communicate. And dialogue means compromise, listening to others' views, and respecting others' rights in a spirit of reconciliation. Nobody will be 100% winner, and nobody will be 100% loser. That is the practical way. In fact, that is the only way. Today, as the world becomes smaller and smaller, the concept of us and them is almost outdated. If our interests existed independently of those of others, then it would be possible to have a complete winner and a complete loser. But since in reality we all depend on one another, our interests and those of others are very interconnected. So how can you gain 100% victory? It is impossible. You have to share half-half, or maybe 60% this side and 40% the other side. Without this approach, reconciliation is impossible. The reality of the world today means that we need to learn to think in this way. This is the basis of my own approach, the middle way approach. Tibetans will not be able to gain 100% victory for whether we like it or not. The future of Tibet very much depends on China. Therefore, in the spirit of reconciliation, I advocate a sharing of interests so that genuine progress is possible. Compromise is the only way. Through non-violent means we can share views, feelings, and rights, and in this way we can solve the problem. I sometimes call the 20th century a century of bloodshed, a century of war. Over this century, there have been more conflicts, more bloodshed, and more weapons than ever before. Now, on the basis of the experience we have all had this century and of what we have learned from it, I think we should look to the next century to be one of dialogue. The principle of non-violence should be practiced everywhere. This cannot be achieved simply by sitting here and praying. It means work and effort, and yet more effort. Buddhist reflections. Due to the unusual brevity of this Mind and Life conference, which lasted 2 days instead of the 5 days, for all the other meetings in this series, Robert Livingston asked me to write a concluding essay, providing further context, elucidation of the Buddhist topics raised here by the Dalai Lama. The following is my attempt to fulfill that wish, principally setting forth certain Buddhist perspectives on the mind-body problem, and at times viewing modern scientific assertions in light of the Buddhist worldview. My motivation in doing so is not to demonstrate the superiority of one view over the other, but to open up new avenues of theoretical and empirical research to scientists and Buddhists alike. For there are, I believe, an increasing number of people today who, like myself, feel that modern neuroscience and Buddhism have a great deal to learn from each other. Neither has soul access to exploring the true nature of the mind or body, the reality of suffering. The fundamental structure of Buddhism as a whole is known as the Four Noble Truths. All Buddhist theories and practices are presented within the context of these four, namely the reality of suffering, the reality of the sources of suffering, the reality of the cessation of suffering, together with its underlying causes, and, finally, the reality of the path to such cessation. The Buddha's injunctions regarding these four is that one should recognize the reality of suffering, eliminate the sources of suffering, accomplish the cessation of suffering, and follow the path leading to cessation. Buddhism identifies two kinds of suffering, physical and mental. The two are not identical, for it is experientially apparent that one may be physically uncomfortable. For instance, while engaging in a strenuous physical workout, while mentally cheerful. Conversely, one may be mentally distraught while experiencing physical comfort. This immediately raises the issue of the mind-body relationship, the fact that we have compelling grounds for not simply equating mental and physical degrees of well-being implies a kind of affective dualism between the body and mind. Such dualism is explicitly accepted by Buddhism, and no reasons were presented in this conference why this should be refuted by modern neuroscience. Affective dualism may be included in the broader category of what may be deemed experiential. Dualism, our experiences of objective physical phenomena are quite unlike our experiences of subjective mental phenomena. An event like an apple dropping from a tree or a thing like an apple itself appears quite different from the event of losing hope or the experience of confidence. Similarly, there are significant experiential differences between objectively observing brain processes and subjectively observing mental processes. The former have specific locations and are composed of material entities that have shape, color, mass, and numerous other physical attributes. Mental processes seem to lack those physical attributes while possessing qualities of their own that are not apparent in brain processes. The fact that Buddhist contemplatives have observed the mind for centuries yet formulated no theory of the brain implies that introspective knowledge of the mind does not necessarily shed any light on the brain. Likewise, the study of the brain alone, independent of all first-person accounts of mental states, does not necessarily yield any knowledge of mental phenomena. Thus, experiential dualism, which maintains that physical and mental phenomena experientially seem to be different, is accepted by Buddhism as well as by at least some of the scientists in this meeting. Experiential dualism also includes what may be called causal dualism for the mind-body system. In Alan Hobson's words, is clearly open to interventions of two distinctive kinds. One is a biological intervention, the other is a conceptual intervention. Lewis Judd concurs when he comments that there is evidence that there may be a synergistic effect between psychopharmacology and specific forms of psychotherapy. For with the combination of the two, the rate of relief for the clinically depressed is higher than if one administers medications alone. Likewise, Buddhism maintains that the mind is influenced by and exerts its own influence upon both mental and physical phenomena. What shall we make of such mind-body dualisms which are commonly accepted in Buddhism and in modern science? The Madhyamaka view, which the Dalai Lama endorses, and which in Tibet is generally considered the pinnacle of Buddhist philosophy, maintains that humans have an innate tendency to reify both the contents of experience as well as ourselves as experiencing agents. According to this view, while it is useful to recognize the apparent differences between physical and mental events in the above ways, it is a profound error to conclude that nature itself, independently of our conceptual constructs, has people, created some absolute demarcation between physical and mental phenomena. Thus, the Madhyamaka view explicitly refutes Cartesian substance dualism, which has been so roundly condemned by contemporary neuroscientists. Madhyamikas, or proponents of the Madhyamaka view, declare that if the mind and body did each exist inherently, independently of conceptual designations, they could never interact. Thus, there is a deep incongruity between appearances and reality. While mind and matter seem to be inherently different types of independently existing stuff, such appearances are misleading. This becomes apparent only by an ontological analysis of the nature of both types of phenomena. The difficulty of providing any explanation for the causal interaction of the body and mind if the two are regarded as real separate things has been clearly addressed in this conference, and it is a chief reason why the great majority of neuroscientists have adopted a physicalist view of the mind. From a Buddhist perspective, while this step eliminates the need for any causal mechanism relating a non-physical mind with the brain, it has the disadvantage of shedding no light on the actual nature of consciousness or its origins. Indeed, though, modern neuroscience has discovered many elements of the brain and neural processes that are necessary for the production of specific conscious processes, it has provided no cogent explanation of the nature of consciousness, nor does this discipline have any scientific means of detecting the presence or absence of consciousness in any organism whatsoever. Over the years since this meeting, I have heard no more illuminating materialist explanation of consciousness than that offered here, namely that it is simply a natural condition of the activated brain. Nor have I heard anything more revealing concerning the origins of consciousness than the statement that it is something that arises when there are enough neurons with elaborate enough connections to support conscious activity. Such accounts actually explain nothing, and they can hardly be counted as scientific theories, for they do not lend themselves to either empirical verification or refutation. Not only do Madhyamikas reject the notion that the mind is an inherently existent substance or thing, they similarly deny that physical phenomena, as we experience and conceive of them, are things in themselves. Rather, physical phenomena are said to exist in relation to our perceptions and conceptions. What we perceive is inescapably related to our perceptual modes of observation, and the ways in which we conceive of phenomena are inescapably related to our concepts and languages. In denying the independent self-existence of all the phenomena that make up the world of our experience, the Madhyamaka view departs from both the substance dualism of Descartes and the substance monism, namely physicalism, that is, characteristic of modern science. The physicalism propounded by many contemporary scientists seems to assert that the real world is composed of physical things in themselves, while all mental phenomena are regarded as mere appearances devoid of any reality in and of themselves. Much is made of this difference between appearances and reality. The Madhyamaka view also emphasizes the disparity between appearances and reality, but in a radically different way. All the mental and physical phenomena that we experience declares appear as if they existed in and of themselves, utterly independent of our modes or perception and conception. They appear to be inherently existing things, but in reality they exist as dependently related events. Their dependence is threefold. 1. Phenomena arise in dependence upon preceding causal influences. 2. They exist in dependence upon their own parts and/or attributes. And 3. The phenomena that make up the world of our experience, dependent upon our verbal and conceptual designations of them. This threefold dependence is not intuitively obvious, for it is concealed by the appearance of phenomena as being self-sufficient and independent of conceptual designation. On the basis of these misleading appearances, it is quite natural to think of, or conceptually apprehend phenomena as self-defining things in themselves. This tendency is known as reification, and according to the Madhyamaka view, this is an inborn delusion that provides the basis for a host of mental afflictions. Reification decontextualizes. It views phenomena without regard to the causal nexus in which they arise, and without regard to the specific means of observation and conceptualization by which they are known. The Madhyamaka, or centrist view, is so called for it seeks to avoid the two extremes of reifying phenomena on the one hand and of denying their existence on the other. In the Madhyamaka view, mental events are no more or less real than physical events. In terms of our common sense experience, differences of kind do exist between physical and mental phenomena. While the former commonly have mass, location, velocity, shape, size, and numerous other physical attributes, these are not generally characteristic of mental phenomena. For example, we do not commonly conceive of the feeling of affection for another person as having mass or location. These physical attributes are no more appropriate to other mental events such as sadness, a recalled image from one's childhood, the visual perception of a rose, or consciousness of any sort. Mental phenomena are therefore not regarded as being physical, for the simple reason that they lack many of the attributes that are uniquely characteristic of physical phenomena. Thus, Buddhism has never adopted the physicalist principle that regards only physical things as real. To return to the first noble truth, both physical and mental suffering are to be recognized, but according to the Madhyamaka view, neither exists as a thing in itself, and therefore the dualism between them is of a relative, not an absolute nature. The reality of the sources of suffering. Just as Buddhism recognizes two types of suffering, mental and physical, so does it affirm the existence of both mental and physical causal influences that give rise to suffering. Physical injury, for example, produces physical pain, and it may also result in mental anguish. On the other hand, certain attitudes such as arrogance, insecurity, craving, hostility, and jealousy may also result in mental distress, and these mental impulses may also lead one into activities that produce physical pain as well. It is also apparent that physical illnesses and injuries do not necessarily result in mental distress. They do not do so for everyone whenever such physical events occur, and mental suffering may arise even in the absence of any apparent physical influences. For example, one may feel deeply distressed by not receiving a telephone call from someone. This is not to say that there are no neurophysiological correlates to such unhappiness. That is, that there are no brain events that may be necessary for the arising of unhappiness. But it is not evident that those physical processes are the primary causes of one's distress. Indeed, Tibetan Buddhism asserts that all the mental states we experience as humans do have physiological correlates in the body, but it does not reduce the subjectively experienced mental states to purely objective bodily states. As the Dalai Lama has affirmed many times, if elements of Buddhist doctrine, including the Madhyamaka view, are compellingly refuted by new empirical evidence or cogent reasoning, then those Buddhist tenets must be abandoned. Many neuroscientists today claim that mental processes are in fact nothing other than brain processes. All mental events are either identical to brain events or are solely produced by them and have no existence apart from them. This view is at variance with Buddhism, so if there are compelling grounds for adopting it, Buddhist doctrine should be revised accordingly. The ever-growing body of neuroscientific discoveries concerning the correspondence of specific mental processes to specific neural events can be reasonably interpreted in either of two ways. This evidence might suggest that mental processes are identical to, or at least concomitant with their corresponding brain processes. If this turns out to be the case, this could be regarded as evidence in support of the materialist view that the mind is simply a function of the brain, but this is certainly not the only logical conclusion that could be drawn from such evidence. Alternatively, such correspondences between mental and neural processes might demonstrate that mental processes occur in dependence upon brain processes. This suggests a causal relation between two sorts of phenomena, which leaves open the possibility that there may be other causes, possibly of a non-physical cognitive nature, that are necessary for the production of mental processes. Common sense experience suggests that mental and physical events exert causal influences upon each other. It has long been known that physical stimuli from our environment and from our body influence our perceptions, our thoughts and feelings, and mental activity, including those same perceptions, thoughts and feelings, influences the body. Buddhists take such causal interrelatedness at face value. Neither physical nor mental causal agency is discounted due to any speculative presuppositions. Buddhism regards subjectively experienced mental events as being non-physical in the sense that they are not composed of particles of matter. It regards physical events as being non-mental in the sense that they are not of the nature of cognition. Given this limited kind of dualism, what kind of physical mechanism does it posit to account for the causal interaction between these two kinds of phenomena? This question presupposes that all causation requires physical mechanisms, but this assumption has never been held by Buddhists. It is not evident to me that contemporary physics refutes the limited dualist view proposed by the Madhyamaka view. Modern cosmology suggests that the physical world may have arisen from space itself, which is not composed of particles of matter, and hence is not physical in the above Buddhist sense of the term. Many physicists now regard time too as being very like a dimension of space, and even energy itself is not necessarily a purely objective material entity. While the principle of the conservation of energy has often been posited by neuroscientists as a physical law that prohibits any non-material influences in the physical world, Richard Feynman himself, an avowed physicalist, points out that this is a mathematical principle and not a description of a mechanism or anything concrete. He adds that in physics today, we have no knowledge of what energy is, one leaving open the possibility, as the Madhyamakas propose that, energy as we conceive it is not something that exists purely objectively as an independent physical reality. Given the interchangeability of mass and energy, this raises interesting questions concerning the ontological status of matter as well. The contemporary theoretical physicist Yuan Squires explicitly claims that the conservation laws of physics should not be posited as compelling grounds for refuting dualist hypotheses of mind and matter. 2. Until the work of Newton, physicists believed that all forces were simply push-pull effects of material bodies. But Newton's law of gravitation countered that the presence of an object at one place could influence the behavior of another at an arbitrarily large distance away, without any intervening medium or mechanism. Thus, as Squires points out, materialism in its narrowest interpretation died in the 17th century. Similarly, until the late 19th century, most scientists viewed the world from the perspective of mechanistic materialism, which required a material medium for the propagation of light. But this principle of mechanism also became obsolete when Maxwell mathematically demonstrated that no such medium was necessary, and Michelson and Morley empirically demonstrated the absence of any physical evidence for such a medium. Thus, the classical principle of mechanism died in the 19th century and was even more deeply entombed by 20th century discoveries in the field of quantum mechanics. 1. The examples cited above speculative. Preconceptions have been dispelled by advances in knowledge in the best spirit of scientific inquiry. To return to the Buddhist account of mind-body interactions, if mental and physical processes do not influence each other by means of some mechanism, how do they interact? Buddhism begins by affirming the validity of our common sense conclusion that mental and physical phenomena influence each other, a point that the scientists in this conference explicitly confirmed. This affirmation is made on the basis of a very straightforward Buddhist definition of causality. A can be regarded as a cause of B if and only if 1 ampere precedes B, and 2 were the occurrence of A to have been averted, the occurrence of B would have been averted. Thus, this phenomenological theory of causality does not necessarily require mechanism. As the Dalai Lama pointed out, there is a simple twofold classification of causality that has a strong bearing on the nature of consciousness. A may be a substantial cause of B, in which case it actually transforms into B, or A may be a cooperative cause of B, in which case it contributes to the occurrence of B but does not transform into it. Now, if mental states are in fact nothing other than brain states, then there is no problem in asserting that prior neurophysiological events transform into mental states, and thereby act as their substantial causes. But to conclude with certainty that mental events are identical to their neural correlates, or that those mental events are simply a function or state of the corresponding brain states, it would have to be demonstrated empirically that the two occur simultaneously and not sequentially. This would entail knowing the precise moment when a mental event takes place and the precise moment its neural correlate takes place, and ascertaining whether those two moments are simultaneous or sequential. To the best of my knowledge, this has not yet been done, and it is not clear to me how it could be done with sufficient precision. If mental events are produced from prior neural events, the two cannot be identical, in which case it is valid to ask, do physical processes act as substantial causes or as cooperative causes for mental processes? If physical events in causing non-physical mental events were to transform into them, the mass energy of those physical events would have to disappear in the process. This is a position rejected by Buddhism and science alike, albeit for different reasons. Buddhism, therefore, proposes that physical processes may act as cooperative but not substantial causes for mental processes. In the meantime, physical events commonly act as substantial causes for subsequent physical events. But this raises the question, if preceding physical processes act only as cooperative causes for mental events, what, if anything, are the substantial causes of mental events? If mental processes had no substantial causes, this would imply that they arise from nothing. Buddhism rejects this possibility, just as it rejects the notion that physical events can arise from nothing. The conclusion drawn by Buddhism is that prior mental events act as the substantial causes of subsequent mental events. At times, specific mental states enter a dormant state, as for example when visual awareness is withdrawn as one falls asleep. But the continuum of the mind is never annihilated, nor does it ever arise from nothing. The whole of Buddhism is concerned with identifying the nature and origins of suffering and with exploring means to eliminate suffering from its source. Relying chiefly on contemplative and logical modes of inquiry, it is concerned chiefly with mental afflictions as opposed to physical illness, and it has attended more to the mental causes of distress than to physical causes. In its pursuit of understanding the physical causes of mental suffering, Buddhism has much to learn from modern neuroscience. There is nothing in Buddhism to refute genetic influences, electrochemical imbalances in the brain, and other types of brain damage as contributing to mental dysfunctions. But in the face of such compelling evidence, a Buddhist might ask such questions as if two people are genetically prone to a certain type of mental disorder. Why is it that one may succumb to the disease and the other not? Likewise, two people may be subjected to very similar kinds of trauma, yet their psychological responses may be very different. To limit the pursuit of such questions solely to physiological causation seems unjustified regardless of one's metaphysical orientation. The identification of a physical cause of a mental disorder does not preclude the possibility of important psychological factors also being involved. Thus, counseling someone to avoid or more successfully manage certain kinds of circumstances that may lead to mental problems may be sound advice. However, Buddhism is more concerned with identifying and healing the inner mental processes that make one vulnerable to such outer influences. Rather than trying to control or avoid outer circumstances, Buddhism recognizes that many difficult outer circumstances are uncontrollable and at times unavoidable. Therefore, it focuses primarily on exploring the malleability of the mind, especially in terms of making it less prone to afflictions, regardless of one's environment. In short, Buddhism places a greater emphasis on controlling one's own mind rather than on controlling one's environment. This may be why the Dalai Lama expressed such an interest in the range of causes of such mental disorders, as chronic depression for Buddhism is concerned with counteracting the principal causes of such disorders and not simply with treating their symptoms. For all the medical advances in understanding chronic depression, Louis Judd candidly acknowledged that antidepressants do not cure these disorders. They treat or manage them as clinicians try to remove the symptoms. This may be immensely useful in the short term, but for the long term, Buddhism stresses the importance of identifying the necessary and sufficient causes of all kinds of mental disorders, with the hope that they may be eliminated and the individual may be utterly healed. Why is it that medical science so often confines itself to explanations involving physical causation, and so swiftly relegates other influences to the euphemistic category of placebo effects? Bearing in mind that a placebo is defined as something that has no significant medical effects. I suspect this is largely due to the fact that for the first 300 years following the scientific revolution, there was no science of the mind in the West. And for the first 100 years, in the development of psychology, the nature, origins, and causal efficacy of consciousness were widely ignored, with the brief exception of a few introspectionists, such as William James. As James commented, those phenomena to which we attend closely become real for us, and those we disregard are reduced to the status of imaginary, illusory appearances, equivalent finally to nothing at all. 1. While the brain has become very real for scientists observing the objective physical correlates of mental activity with no comparable development of sophisticated techniques for exploring mental phenomena firsthand, such subjective phenomena as mental imagery, beliefs, emotions, and consciousness itself have been widely regarded as mere illusory epiphenomena of the brain. Buddhist contemplatives, on the other hand, have long ignored the brain's influence on the mind and therefore attribute little, if any, significance to it. But they have developed a wide array of introspective contemplative methods for training the attention probing firsthand into the nature, origins, and causal efficacy of mental events, including consciousness itself, and for transforming the mind in beneficial ways. Centuries of experience derived from Buddhist practice suggest that the mind may be far more malleable and may hold far greater potential than is now assumed by modern science. However, as the Dalai Lama has commented elsewhere, these claims are like paper money. If we are to attribute value to them, we must be able to verify that they are backed by valid experience. Only that is the gold standard behind the currency of these Buddhist claims. Does modern cognitive science know enough about the brain and mind to safely conclude that the hypothesis of a non-physical mind is useless? When asked what percentage of the functioning of the brain we presently understand, neuroscientist Robert Livingston replies, 0.5%, and Louis Judd concurs that we have barely scratched the surface. Nevertheless, one may still hold to a physicalist view of the mind on the grounds that there is no scientific evidence for the existence of any non-physical phenomena whatsoever, so the hypothesis of a non-physical mind should not be entertained even for a moment. This would be a very cogent conclusion if science had developed instruments for detecting the presence of non-physical phenomena, and those instruments yielded negative results. However, to the best of my knowledge, no such instruments have ever been developed. Thus, the statement that there is no scientific evidence for the existence of anything non-physical is unsubstantiated. If neuroscientists had a thorough understanding of all the necessary and sufficient causes for the production of consciousness, and if all those causes turned out to be physical, then all dualist theories of the mind and brain would have to be rejected. But contemporary neuroscientists agree that they are very far from that goal. It is pertinent to point out here that, strictly speaking, there is still no scientific evidence for the existence of consciousness. Scientists know of its existence only because they are conscious themselves, and they infer on that non-scientific basis that other similar beings are conscious as well. But how similar to a human being must another entity be to be deemed conscious? When it comes to the presence or absence of consciousness in unborn human fetuses and in other animals, there is no scientific consensus, for the simple reason that there is no scientific means of detecting the presence or absence of consciousness in anything whatsoever. This accounts for the current lack of scientific knowledge concerning the nature, origins, and causal efficacy of consciousness. With this in mind, we now turn to the topic of the cessation of suffering and the possibility of the cessation of consciousness itself. The reality of the cessation of suffering. Once the full range of suffering has been identified and its necessary and sufficient causes discovered, Buddhism asks, is it possible to be forever freed from suffering and its sources many? Scientists would respond with a swift affirmative: when you die, all your experiences stop, for consciousness vanishes. In other words, the cessation of suffering occurs due to personal annihilation. While this is often promoted as a scientific view from a Buddhist perspective, the present state of neuroscientific ignorance concerning the origins and nature of consciousness lends little credibility to any conclusions scientists may draw about the effect of biological death on consciousness. Tibetan Buddhism asserts that during the process of dying, our normal sensory and conceptual faculties become dormant. The end result of this process, when all our normal mental faculties have withdrawn, is not the cessation of consciousness, but rather the manifestation of very subtle consciousness, from which all other mental processes originate. The presence of this subtle consciousness, according to Tibetan Buddhism, is not contingent upon the brain, nor does it entail a loss of consciousness. Rather, the experience of this consciousness is the experience of unmediated primordial awareness, which is regarded as the fundamental constituent of the natural world. When the connection between this subtle consciousness and the body is severed, death occurs. But this consciousness does not vanish. On the contrary, from it temporarily arises a mental body, akin to the type of non-physical body one may assume in a dream. Following a series of dreamlike experiences subsequent to one's death, this mental body also perishes, and in the next moment one's next life begins, for example, in the womb of one's future mother. During the development of the fetus, the various sensory and conceptual faculties are developed in reliance upon the formation of the body. But mental consciousness is said to be present from the moment of conception. What are the empirical grounds for this theory of metempsychosis presented here only in outline? Many highly trained Tibetan Buddhist contemplatives claim to be able to recall the events of their previous death, the subsequent dreamlike experience, and the process of taking birth. In many cases, they also recall detailed events from their past lives, for the memories are stored, according to this theory, in the continuum of mental consciousness that carries on from one life to another. Other people too may have the sense of recalling their past lives, as in the example the Dalai Lama gave of the two girls in India, who purportedly recollected the names of people that they had known in previous lives. However, most people do not remember their previous lives. According to Buddhism, for those experiences are eclipsed by the more recent experiences of this life, just as most adults have few memories of their infancy in this life. In this conference, the scientists' difficulty in understanding the Buddhist concept of subtle consciousness may appear odd, for the notion of subtle physical phenomena is common in science. For example, the electromagnetic field of a single electron is a subtle phenomenon which can be detected only with very sophisticated instruments. Likewise, the light from galaxies billions of light years away is very subtle and can be detected only with very powerful, refined telescopes. Similarly, Buddhism posits the existence of subtle states of awareness and mental events that can be detected only with very sensitive, focused, sustained attention. Ordinary consciousness is too unrefined and unstable to detect such phenomena, but Buddhism has devised numerous techniques for training the attention unknown to modern science, so that it can ascertain increasingly more subtle mental, physical phenomena. 1. While subtle states of awareness can be detected only with very refined awareness, even the grossest mental states such as rage, which can be ascertained firsthand by an ordinary untrained mind, cannot be directly detected with the physical instruments of modern neuroscience. They detect only the neurophysiological correlates of such mental states and other related physical behavior. Thus, all states of consciousness may be regarded as too subtle for modern neuroscience to detect, whereas belief in an afterlife, or the continuity of consciousness after death, is often regarded as an optimistic act of faith. In the West, Buddhism counters that the belief in the automatic eternal cessation of suffering at death due to disappearance of consciousness is an optimistic act of faith, with no compelling empirical or rational grounds to support it. Buddhism does indeed propose that suffering together with its source can be radically, irreversibly dispelled, but this requires skillful, sustained refinement of the mind and the elimination of the root cause of suffering, namely ignorance and delusion. Through the cultivation of contemplative insight and knowledge, the means for developing such insight are presented in the Buddhist path to liberation, the reality of the path to the cessation of suffering. According to Tibetan Buddhism, the fundamental root of suffering is a type of inborn ignorance regarding the nature of one's own identity, one's own consciousness, and the world of which one is conscious. This tradition claims that all but highly realized people are born with these, but they can be attenuated and even eliminated entirely. Specifically, under the influence of such inborn ignorance, we grasp on the absolute duality of self and other, which leads in turn to the reification of all manner of mental and physical phenomena, as well as the division of mental and physical itself. According to the Madhyamaka view, such ignorance is to be countered by realizing the manner in which all phenomena, including oneself, exist as dependently related events as described earlier in this essay. In addition to such inborn ignorance, human beings are subject to a second type of mental affliction known as speculative ignorance. No one is born with this kind of ignorance, rather it is acquired through false indoctrination and speculation. Buddhism maintains that as a result of adopting unfounded speculative presuppositions, we may become more confused than we would have been without receiving any formal education whatsoever. Thus, the proper task of Buddhist training is not to indoctrinate people into a given creed or set of philosophical tenets. Rather, it is to challenge people to examine and re-examine their own most cherished assumptions about the nature of reality. By repeatedly putting our presuppositions to the test of critical examination by way of careful observation and clear reasoning, we empower ourselves to discover and eliminate our own speculative confusion. Once this is cleared away, we are in a much more effective position to detect and vanquish the underlying inborn ignorance and its resultant mental afflictions. In Buddhism, mental health and spiritual maturation may be measured in direct relation to one's success in overcoming these two types of mental afflictions. With this twofold classification of ignorance in mind, let us examine the interface between Buddhism and modern science in terms of two quite disparate ways of confronting reality. One is by means of adhering to an ideology, and the other is by pursuing scientific inquiry. The eminent anthropologist Clifford Geertz comments in this regard, "Science names the structure of situations in such a way that the attitude contained toward them is one of disinterestedness. But ideology names the structure of situations in such a way that the attitude contained toward them is one of commitment." One Geertz regards religious belief as a paradigmatic example of an ideology, and he remarks that this involves a prior acceptance of authority, which transforms experience. In short, with respect to any ideology, one who would know must first believe. The problem of adopting an ideology arises when there is a discrepancy between what is believed and what can be established by compelling evidence. But what constitutes compelling evidence, and for whom scientists who are committed to physicalism are extremely skeptical of any evidence that is incompatible with that view? As Alan Hobson comments, their minds must be open about such evidence, but that opening is quite narrow. On the other hand, Tibetan Buddhists, who are committed to the theory of metempsychosis, are extremely skeptical of neuroscientific claims that the mind is simply an epiphenomenon or function of the brain. Thus, with the same neuroscientific evidence presented to them, physicalists find compelling evidence for refuting the non-physical existence of the mind, whereas traditional Tibetan Buddhists and other non-materialists do not. Most scientists would acknowledge that they do not know that consciousness is nothing more than a function of the brain, and most Buddhists, I believe, would acknowledge they do not know the consciousness is something more than a function of the brain, and yet convictions run strong in both ways, indicating that both sides are committed to disparate ideologies. If this is true, then scientists together with Buddhists may be equally prone to ideologies, or to use Robert Livingston's term speculative suppositions. While the history of science is largely an account of disabusing ourselves of mistaken speculative suppositions, as Robert Livingston points out, Buddhism also places a high priority on dispelling such ignorance in order to eliminate the deeper inborn ignorance that lies at the root of suffering. Perhaps, in order to explore this commonality, the Dalai Lama cited a threefold classification of phenomena that is made in Buddhism. The first of these categories includes phenomena that can be directly apprehended or empirically demonstrated. The second includes those that are known by logical inference but not directly. The third includes those that are accepted simply on the basis of someone else's testimony or authority. He hastened to add that these are not qualities inherent to different types of phenomena. Rather, they are related to the limitations of our own knowledge. An event that is known to one person solely on the basis of someone else's testimony may be inferentially known by a second person. The same event may be known directly by a third person. Everyone agreed that it is the task of science to reduce the number of phenomena in the third category and to move as many phenomena as possible from the second to the first category. This, in fact, is the goal of Buddhism as well. Since it is widely regarded in the West simply as a religion, Buddhist doctrine is still widely regarded as an ideology, in contrast to scientific knowledge. Indeed, many Buddhists do uncritically adopt the tenets of their faith simply as a creed, without subjecting it to either empirical or rational analysis. Ideologies are commonly based not on immediate experience or on cogent logical analysis, but on the testimony of someone else, such as the Buddha, whom one takes to be an authority. If the words of the Buddha are not accepted as authoritative, then the basis for this ideology vanishes into thin air. Even though many Buddhists do accept Buddhist doctrine in this way, the Buddha admonished his followers, "Monks, just as the wise accept gold after testing it by heating, cutting, and rubbing it, so are my words to be accepted after examining them, but not out of respect for me." 1. Thus, unquestioning commitment to an ideology is not only unnecessary in Buddhism, it was explicitly condemned by the Buddha himself. While scientific knowledge is commonly equated with empirical discoveries, with an ever-decreasing reliance upon inference and others' testimony, I believe even a cursory examination of the history of science demonstrates that this view is far from accurate. With the enormous specialization among the sciences and the vast amount of research that has been conducted throughout history and throughout the world today, no single individual can hope to empirically confirm the findings of the rest of the scientific community. Moreover, empirical scientific research relies upon the sophisticated tools of technology, and few scientists have the time or inclination to check the engineering of every instrument they use. For scientific knowledge to progress, scientists must rely increasingly on the claims of their scientific and engineering colleagues of the past and present. In most cases, I believe that trust is well earned, but in most cases that is indeed reliance upon others' authority, not upon one's own observations or rigorous logic. As this is true within the scientific community, it is all the more true for the public at large, which provides the funding for scientific research. People regard scientists as authorities in their respective fields and accept their words. On the basis of such trust, this trust is warranted by the belief that if one were to engage in the necessary scientific training and perform a specific type of research for oneself, one could in principle verify others' findings empirically or at least by logical analysis. It is with this same kind of trust that Buddhist contemplatives receive formal training in Buddhism and try to put to the test the Buddha's own purported discoveries about the nature of suffering, the source of suffering, its cessation, and the path to that cessation. Buddhist inquiry into the above three types of phenomena proceeds by way of 4 principles of reason, to which the Dalai Lama referred only briefly in this meeting. 1. To expand briefly on his comments here, the principle of dependence refers to the dependence of compounded phenomena upon their causes, such as the dependence of visual perception upon the optic nerve. It also pertains to the dependence of any type of phenomenon upon its own parts and attributes, or upon other entities, as in the interdependence of up and down and parent and child. The principle of efficacy pertains to the causal efficacy of specific phenomena, such as the capacity of a kernel of corn to produce a stalk of corn. The principle of valid proof consists of 3 means by which one establishes the existence of anything, namely, direct perception, cogent inference, and knowledge based upon testimony, which correspond to the above threefold epistemological and explicitly not ontological classification of phenomena. The principle of reality refers to the nature of phenomena that is present in their individuating and generic properties. An individuating property of heat, for instance, is heat, and one of its generic properties is that it is impermanent. The Dalai Lama cites, as examples of this principle, the fact that the body is composed of particles of matter, and the fact that consciousness is simply of the nature of luminosity and cognizance. These facts are simply to be accepted at face value. They are not explained by investigating the causes of the body and mind, or their individual causal efficacy. Let us apply these 4 principles to the materialist understanding of consciousness. According to this view, consciousness is simply a natural condition of the activated brain, much as heat is a natural condition of fire, the principle of reality. As such, consciousness vanishes as soon as the brain is no longer active, the principle of dependence, and it has no causal efficacy of its own apart from the brain, the principle of efficacy. These conclusions are based on the direct observations of neuroscientists investigating mind-brain correlates. They are inferred by philosophers who know of such correlates, and they are accepted as fact by many people who accept scientific materialism without knowing for themselves its supporting empirical facts or logical arguments, the principle of valid proof. According to the Buddhist view, in contrast, consciousness is simply of the nature of luminosity and cognizance, much as fire is of the nature of heat. The principle of reality, specific states of consciousness, arise in dependence upon the sense organs, sensory objects, and prior non-physical states of consciousness, the principle of dependence, and they, in turn, exert influences on subsequent mental and physical states, including indirect influences on the outside physical world. Principle of efficacy. These conclusions are purportedly based on the direct observations of contemplatives who have thoroughly fathomed the nature of consciousness. They are inferred by philosophers on the basis of others' experiences, and they are accepted as fact by many Buddhists who accept Buddhist doctrine without knowing for themselves its supporting empirical facts or logical arguments, the principle of valid proof. In evaluating these two radically different ways of understanding consciousness, the central question arises: which people are deemed to be authorities on consciousness due to their privileged direct knowledge? Modern Westerners may look with deep skepticism upon anyone claiming to be an authority who is not an accomplished neuroscientist. Traditional Tibetan Buddhists, on the other hand, may look with equal skepticism upon anyone claiming to be an authority on consciousness who has not accomplished advanced degrees of meditative concentration by which to explore the nature of the mind introspectively. By what criteria does one judge who is and who is not an authority who can provide reliable testimony? In other words, whose direct observations are to be deemed trustworthy? I strongly suspect that answers to these questions must address the role of ideology, and perhaps it will turn out to be true that one who would know, either through inference or on the basis of authoritative testimony, must first believe. These questions certainly deserve to be examined in much greater detail, especially in the context of such cross-cultural dialogue. Before closing, I would like to raise one final issue that is central to Buddhism and to the Dalai Lama himself, and that is compassion. As the Dalai Lama has commented many times, philosophical and religious theories vary from culture to culture, and scientific theories are subject to change over time. But the importance of love and compassion is a constant throughout human history. The Tibetan Buddhist path to liberation and spiritual awakening likewise places an equal emphasis on the cultivation of insight and compassion. Indeed, the experiential knowledge sought in Buddhism is said to support and enhance one's compassion, and any view that undermines compassion is viewed with extreme skepticism. It was perhaps with this in mind that at one point in this conference, the Dalai Lama asked the Western participants whether they, who asserted the identity of the mind, and implicitly the person with the brain, could feel affection for a pace-long brain. The general response among the neuroscientists was perhaps best expressed by Antonio Damasio. What I can feel affection for is a particular individual, a person whom I know. I don't feel any affection whatsoever for brains. Louis Judd commented in a similar vein. The physician is dedicating his or her knowledge and skills on behalf of the patient as a totality, as a person, not to some fractional part or organ system. The patient is not just a diseased liver or diseased brain or whatever. The patient is an integrated whole person. But where is this particular individual or whole person to be found? According to physicalism, is this anything more than a baseless illusion? In which case, doesn't this ideology critically undermine love and compassion? According to the Madhyamaka view, a person cannot be identified with the mind alone, or with the brain or the rest of the body. But no individual can be found under analysis, apart from the body and mind either. No I or self can be found under such ontological scrutiny. So Madhyamikas conclude, like many neuroscientists today, that the self does not exist objectively or inherently independently of conceptual designation. However, the Madhyamikas add that while none of us exist as independent things, we do exist in interrelationship with each other. Thus, we do not exist in alienation from other sentient beings and from our surrounding environment. Rather, we exist in profound interdependence. And this realization is said to yield a far deeper sense of love and compassion than that which is conjoined with a reified sense of our individual separateness and autonomy. Whatever fresh insights maybe arise from the collaboration of Buddhists and neuroscientists, it is my hope that these may lead us to become more and more warm-hearted persons. I would like to conclude this essay with the Dalai Lama's own concluding words. Whether compassion has an independent existence within the self or not, compassion certainly is. In daily life, I think the foundation of human hope, the source, assurance of our human future.